All right, the program is now being recorded. Make sure your audio and video are disabled, and your interactions via chat will not appear on the recording.
Thank you so much, Paula. Good morning, everyone, and my welcome to you as well. My name is Morgan Yoshimura, and I'm our Coordinator of Services to Adults here at the San Antonio Public Library. Before we get into today's program and introduce today's presenter, who is Raina Stovall, I just wanted to share a bit of information with you, with everyone who is attending today. You may have seen this recently in the news or through other sources, but Rose Sherman Williams, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, who once she was liberated from the camps that she ended up in during the Holocaust and whatnot, and immigrated to the United States. She made San Antonio her home, and was very, very actively involved with the Holocaust Memorial Museum for many, many years. She passed away recently. And so I just wanted to start today to acknowledge Rose, to acknowledge her passing, share a little bit of information with her about you, and then ask you to join me in a moment of silence. So I'm going to read a little bit of information about Rose here. So Rose Sherwin Williams, a Holocaust survivor and dedicated volunteer, spent decades sharing her story of resilience, honoring her family's memory, and inspiring others with her message of perseverance. Born in Radom, Poland in 1927, so Rose was 97 years old when she passed away. Rose had a happy childhood with her parents and three siblings. Her father owned a leather factory, and life was peaceful until 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. Rose was just 12 years old when her world changed forever. The Sherman family was forced to leave their home and move into a ghetto where they lived in a single room. In 1942, the ghetto was liquidated and Rose was separated from her family. She was sent to work in an ammunition factory before being transported to Auschwitz, where she was tattooed with a number. Life in Auschwitz was harsh. Rose suffered frostbitten feet due to lack of shoes, but she found strength in reunification with her sister Binny. As the war neared its end, Rose was forced on a brutal march to Bergen-Belsen, one of the worst camps she witnessed. Finally, on April 15th, 1945, British troops liberated Rose. After the war, Rose moved to Stuttgart, Germany, before making her way to the United States and settling in San Antonio, Texas, where she built a life with her husband, Jack, and raised their family. In 2019, Rose published her memoir, Letters to Rose, Memoirs with Letters of Impact and Inspiration from the Next Generation, co-written with Becky Hoag and Robin Philbrick. Through this and countless speaking engagements, Rose shared her story with thousands of students and visitors and folks coming to public library programs like this one, ensuring that her legacy of survival and hope would inspire generations to come. Rose was preceded in death by her husband Jack and her son Peter. She is survived by her son AJ, his wife Mary, her three grandsons Alexis, Jason, and Sammy, and extended family, and particularly Becky Hoag, who gave Rose special care for many years. May Rose's blessing be May Rose's memory be a blessing, and may her story continue to inspire others. And at this time, we will observe a moment of silence in Rose's memory. Thank you for observing that moment of silence with us. I will momentarily put in the chat a link to the Holocaust Memorial Museums of San Antonio's website that has a little bit more information about Rose, including her testimonial. And then I will also put in the link that in the chat. We have Rose's book, Rose's Memoir, Letters to Rose, as an ebook. I'm working on getting physical copies, but if you'd like to check out the ebook, that is available as well. So again, thank you for allowing me to share that information. And this time I will turn it back over to Paula to introduce today's presenter, Raina Stovall. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Morgan. Our program this morning is In Their Words, Children's Experiences of Liberation. Using oral history interviews and their transcriptions, today's presenter, Raina Stovall, will discuss the experiences of Holocaust survivors who were liberated from concentration camps as children. How did their experiences differ from adults? What kinds of unique challenges did they face? In their words, Children's Experiences of Liberation will dive into these questions. Our presenter, Raina Stovall, is a senior at Fordham University in New York City. She's an international relations and French double major, the Jewish studies minor, who hopes to pursue a graduate degree in policy next year. She has been a volunteer docent with the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio since she was 16, and has also led tours at New York's Museum of Jewish Heritage. This is her 4th year presenting at Holocaust Learn and Remember. In addition to academics and her involvement at the museum, Raina's favorite pastimes include reading, running, playing soccer, and spending time with her family. Raina?
Righty. Hi, everybody. Oh, I need sharing permissions before I can share my presentation. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here today. My name is Raina Stovall, and when I first knew that I was going to be giving this presentation, my first instinct was to do something with oral history. I founded an oral history project at my university, and I think there's a true beauty and richness to hearing somebody's story from them, from the source. And so today's presentation is going to include some oral history interviews and descriptions of liberation from the source. And so if you have any questions while I'm presenting, please feel free to put them in the chat, or you can hold on to it. And at the very end of the presentation, we'll have a mini Q&A where you can ask anything. So without further ado, in their words, Children's Experiences of Liberation. So I'll go over some definitions and historical overview before getting into oral history as a discipline, and then showing you some oral histories and talking about various aspects of liberation for children. So to start with some background, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum defines the Holocaust as the state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between the years 1933 and 1945. The Jews were the primary target of the Holocaust. However, it wasn't just Jews who were targeted by the Nazis and their allies. They targeted anybody they deemed, quote unquote, racially inferior. This included the Roma and Sinti, who are often referred to as gypsies, homosexual men, the mentally and physically disabled, Jehovah's Witnesses, and several other groups as well. And I'd also like to point out that 6 million people were murdered in the Holocaust, and this 6 million number includes 1.5 million children. But the Holocaust didn't happen overnight, and to truly understand the Holocaust, we'd have to go all the way back to ancient Roman times. However, we don't really have the time for that, so I'm going to keep this a little more brief and start with the end of World War I, which was formally ended by the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles placed the entire blame for World War I onto Germany. And after this, Germany faced a deep, deep depression. Unemployment rates were through the roof, and inflation rates were so bad that some people would even resort to burning their money instead of buying wood to heat their homes, because it was cheaper just to burn the money than to buy the wood. If that gives you kind of an idea of what life was like in Germany at the time and the socioeconomic conditions. And while this was happening, the Nazi Party started to arise. The Nazi Party kind of kicked off in the 1920s And Nazi is actually an acronym for National Socialist German Workers' Party. But I don't want you to get confused with the word socialist. This doesn't mean that they were a left-wing party. They were actually a far right-wing party. And Adolf Hitler, who you can see in this photograph on the right-hand side, was a member of this party. He had kind of risen through the ranks because he was a good public speaker, and he was able to really rally a lot of people behind the Nazis' mission. Now, Hitler had been imprisoned in 1923 with other members of the Nazi Party for attempting to overthrow the Weimar Republic, which was a region in Germany. And while he was imprisoned, he started writing his memoir, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. And in this memoir, he outlined the Nazi and generally his plan for making Nazi Germany a state that would return to its former glory, a global powerhouse. And part of this mission also included scapegoating a group. He kind of put all of Germany's ills onto one group, and this group was the Jewish people. And so after the Nazis began being elected legally into seats of power, one thing that they really pushed was their anti-Semitic ideology. And so they would publish things in newspapers and tabloids, such as this tabloid advertisement right here, that villainified Jews. And so this one right here, you can see the headline. I mean, it's in German, but translated, it reads, "Without a solution to the Jewish question, there can be no redemption of humanity." However, the real turning point where we see Nazi or Germany in general go from a democracy to a totalitarian dictatorship came in 1933. In January 1933, Hitler had been elected chancellor by the president of Germany at the time, Paul von Hindenburg. And in February 1933, the German parliamentary building, the Reichstag, burned down. And Paul von Hindenburg had just passed away. And Adolf Hitler used this moment to grant himself emergency powers, strip some of the rights of German citizens, and effectively become a dictator. And when the Nazi Party got into power in this way, they started implementing laws and regulations to restrict the freedoms of the Jewish people. One of these restrictions was the Nuremberg laws, and the Nuremberg laws included things like Jewish children couldn't go to school with non-Jewish children. There was a curfew for Jews, and Jews had to wear Stars of David on their clothing at all times, which is this young girl at the bottom of your screen. These were only a few examples of the Nuremberg laws, but these restrictions made life very challenging for the Jewish people and created an atmosphere of fear. But this wasn't enough for the Nazis. Jews were still well integrated in society, and so they created what were known as ghettos. You can see a map of one at the bottom right. And these ghettos were small areas of town, often no more than a square mile, where all of the Jews in that city and the surrounding area were forced into. And conditions in these ghettos were absolutely horrendous. There often wasn't enough food to go around, and because of the cramped, unsanitary conditions, many people contracted fatal diseases like TB and typhus. But the real turning point of genocide is what the Nazis called their final solution to the Jewish question. And I put that in air quotes because it was a euphemism. The Nazis were known for using euphemisms that made the horrific things that they were doing sound a little less bad. But the final solution was officially decided upon at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. And I won't touch too much on the death camps, but I will reiterate the fact that 6 million people were murdered in the Holocaust. And while this presentation focuses on Jews, it wasn't just Jews who were imprisoned in these camps either. But while all of this was happening, beginning September 1st, 1939, World War II had broken out with Germany's invasion of Poland. And the Allied front, which was the United States, United Kingdom, and USSR, slowly began to recover the territory that Hitler had taken. He had taken so much of Europe, and it took a long time for the Allied powers to begin advancing enough in the war to defeat them. But when the soldiers liberated these camps, they were absolutely shocked by what they had encountered. While the Allied powers generally had known about the concentration camps years prior, they had prioritized fighting the war, but the soldiers who were going into these camps were unaware of what they were walking into, and there were bodies everywhere, and people were described as walking skeletons. And for the concentration camp, people who had been in concentration camps themselves, a lot of complex emotions arose with liberation. We'll hear some of these stories in a minute. But on one hand, a lot of people were discovering that the people that they loved had all been murdered. While at the other hand, they finally had freedom, and they no longer were in this survival mode. And tragically, many people passed away after liberation because their bodies just could not recover from the trauma and violence that they had endured. But I chose this photograph to kind of represent liberation on the bottom left, because I think, the men's smiles speak for themselves. They're smoking and drinking, and they just look very happy. And so I feel like that's a very positive image to put, at the end of all of this horrific history. So oral history, while generally considered a little bit more unreliable than other forms of concrete physical documentation like legislation, memos, photographs, etc., like I mentioned at the beginning, it provides unique insight into the lived experiences of individuals, such as their emotions, feelings, prejudices, sometimes descriptions even of the way that things smelled, that these other forms of concrete documentation cannot capture. And as I mentioned, there's a beauty in hearing the way that somebody describes what they went through that you just cannot capture the same way in written forms of communication. But if you've ever had a fight with a sibling or a family member, you may know that there are many different versions to every story. And one challenge of oral history is that people are going to remember things differently. And while some things are very small, like, having a different perspective on an event, there are other things that are just factually incorrect, like somebody remembering something happening way before it actually did, or way after it actually did, in a different place than it actually happened. And so while this is a challenge of oral history, I think these are very rectifiable things as long as you are not just using oral history, but using other forms of documents to kind of cross-check and craft a narrative. So oral history, while it has its downsides, like any other form of history, historical documentation, it is truly rich. And as somebody who's conducted dozens of oral history interviews myself, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the importance of the oral historian in a good oral history, because it is so much of an oral history is based on what the interviewer is doing, what kinds of questions that they ask. And with such an intense and emotionally vulnerable topic like the Holocaust, it really is up to the interviewer to make the interviewee feel comfortable and like they can tell their story. And small questions like, could you please elaborate on that a little bit more? Or how did that make you feel? Or even just a simple, tell me more, can really allow the interviewee to tell their story in as much depth as possible. There have been many different oral history projects about the Holocaust, the largest of which are the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Jeff and Toby Herr Oral History Archive and the University of Southern California's Shoah Foundation. I think combined, they've done over 600,000 oral history interviews with Holocaust survivors. But there's many other foundations and organizations that have done oral histories with survivors, including the United States or San Antonio Holocaust Memorial Museum, which, as Morgan mentioned at the beginning, they have conducted interviews with Rose Sherman Williams. So if you're interested in seeing any of these, I highly recommend you look them up. So this first oral history that I'm going to be showing you is from a woman named Sarah Kleinplatz, who was 15 when World War II began and was born in Poland. She had been deported to a work camp in Hamburg in 1944 and was transferred to Bergen-Belsen 6 days before its liberation, similarly to how Rose was. So she was, I don't know if they knew each other, but they were in Bergen-Belsen at the same time. But I'd like you to pay particular attention to the complex emotions you described having upon liberation, and also the emotional maturity that a young girl who was still a teenager must have had to kind of feel this way upon her liberation.
It was terrible, terrible, traumatic. I can't begin to explain to you what Bergen-Belsen was like. If you think that hell was something ever described, nothing can compare to Bergen-Belsen. Nothing, nothing. There we were for 6 days, and the 6th day, when we heard that the German SS ran away and the Hungarian SS took over, that was the last day, the late day of the liberation, but we didn't know we'll be liberated in a few hours. Outside of the barbed wires were big piles of turnips, and we didn't eat 6 days, nothing. No water. We went to the toilet, and there were running down the pipe some drips of water, so people went over and hold the finger to wet their tongue with a drop of water. So when we saw the Hungarian SS is taking over, the German SS is not anymore there, we could see them because all around were those towers with SS. So some people dared to go between the wires to grab a turnip. They opened fire, the Hungarian SS, and they shot so many girls from our camp, also a few. It was terrible. Anyway, that was the next day we were liberated by the British. And very many people died after the liberation because everybody got infected with typhoid. When the British came in, people were too weak even to rejoice. There was more crying and mourning than joy. We realized our losses. It was so terrible, that moment. At one moment, you felt the danger is over. Whoever survived will maybe live. On the other hand, we realized it's too late. It came so much too late, the liberation. We lost so much, we saw so much. It was so terrible to learn the things that we learned during the war, that we saw during the war. Lots of us lost our faith in mankind because we didn't know why nobody comes to help us. We didn't know that the Germans are only the bad ones. We didn't know nothing. We were shut off completely from the whole world. We didn't know what happening in the rest of the world, nothing. In the Logic Ghetto, there was no newspaper, maybe there was a clandestine radio. I hear that some people had it, but the general population never knew it. So when it came to liberation, it was indescribable, our feeling. It was a terrible, terrific relief that it's over, and at the same time facing all the terrible heartache and the sorrow. So we were staying and we were crying, and at one moment we were laughing, and the British said, relax, we are here, you won't be any more hurt, we won't let you hurt. And then we saw a tank coming, and on the tank was staying the camp commandant of Bergen-Belsen, Kramer was his name. And we saw him in chains and handcuffed and so on, and with soldiers guarding him. The moment was unbelievable.
So this is a presentation with the library after all. So I'm going to have some book recommendations throughout the presentation, and I'll have a slide at the very end with all of the books that I recommend that you're welcome to take a picture of if you're interested in checking any of them out. But as Sarah described in her oral history interview, this emotional maturity that she had to develop quite young, and Livia Byton Jackson, in her memoir, I've Lived 1,000 Years Growing Up in the Holocaust, really dives into this experience of what it was like growing up in the Holocaust and how she kind of had to become a parent to herself in order to survive. So you're interested in checking this out. It's available in the San Antonio Public Library system in both audiobook and ebook formats. So this next interviewee is named Marta Weiss, and she was one of 3 Weiss sisters born in Bratislava. She was imprisoned with her sister Eva in Auschwitz, and the two girls were separated from their entire family. And one challenge of being a child during the Holocaust was that most were immediately murdered upon arrival to concentration and death camps. However, Marta and her sister were not. In fact, they underwent horrific medical experiments by the cruel Dr. Joseph Mengele, who is known for conducting the most cruel things on children. And she and her sister survived and was liberated at age 10 by the Soviet army. And this oral history describes her experience of liberation and being in the Soviet-run DP camps. And also hitchhiking between different DP camps in order to find her family with her sister.
What did you do? Well, it wasn't a simple process like liberation. We always thought that we will be liberated and we'll take a train home. We didn't realize, first of all, that the other parts of the world, the Europe, weren't all liberated yet. My hometown of Bratislava wasn't liberated till April 1945, and this was end of January. We were taken to hospital because we were very, very sick, both of us. I had TB and full of lice, of course. I weighed, I think, 17 kilos at the age of 10. So you can imagine, I was like a Muslim. That was the photo that taken by the Russians. And we were in the camp for some months. I remember the Russians loved children. They didn't like the adults so much, but children they loved. I remember being terribly shocked when they called us Еврейские паразиты, the adults, Hebrew parasites. Couldn't understand it after what we'd lived through. These are the liberators, and they're calling the people parasites because they couldn't work. They couldn't move. Many, many people died from too much food. So if you listened to people who in the know-how, it was very difficult. Suddenly your stomach had shrunk and you couldn't eat. And a large number of people after the war died after the war from burst intestines. But we were warned not to eat too much, so we didn't. And because they loved children, Russians loved children, so I remember them taking me on their knee. This is my first memory of the Russians walking in and taking me on my knee. I can still smell the vodka now on the breath.
And for this next part of her interview, I'd like to point out that when she says we, she means her and her sister Eva.
Because she was sicker than I was. And then you learned Russian. Children learn languages very quickly. We learned Russian fairly quickly. And she overheard, in the hospital, I was already out of the hospital, she overheard them say, two Russians talking and saying that they're going to take the children back to Russia. And that much of Russian we already understood because the nurses, everybody was Russian. So she told me that they're going to take us back to Russia, and we didn't want to go. We didn't know that Bratislava wasn't liberated yet. We had no idea. You know, you don't understand it even now. We were children, but even the adults didn't know. We didn't realize that the liberation was periodic, in time, and that Bratislava was still under the Germans. My sister Rosanna was born in March 45, and she was born still under the Germans. My mother had to walk to hospital to have her, and ran away from hospital when she overheard them talk about her. So we didn't realize it was still under German occupation. So Eva called me, when I went to visit her, she said to me, look, we've got to escape, because they're going to send all the children to Russia for re-education, And it was very much on the cards, too. So we, in the night, she got out of the hospital, and we just went on the road. And we went to the next destination. We hitchhiked most of the time. We finished up in other camps, in sort of internment camps. And finally, we finished up in Slovakia, and this took a while. I mean, we were under the Russians they liberated us end of January, and we were there February, March. We were there about 2 months under the Russians, even more. I think, actually, I have the paper somewhere, the Red Cross paper when I was liberated, when the Red Cross gave us the paper. And so we made our way back to Czechoslovakia. We had no idea what happened. In our innocence, and we were children, but it happened to adults too, I believe. we thought we'll get back to Bratislava and we'll find our parents in 60s Palisadnik. It didn't even make sense because we knew that when we left, they weren't there anymore. It had been taken over by the Hlinka guards. So, you know, you didn't think logically. All the survivors thought I'll get back to their places and I'll find their relatives there. So we made our way slowly on foot, by getting lifts to Czechoslovakia, and we finished up in a place, I don't remember the name of it, we've got the documents there. And we finished up at in various DP camps. And then we went to this Jewish family who could take one child and not both. So they took me and they put Eva into another Jewish family. You wouldn't believe it. People who knew us, who knew our family, they knew we were the vice girls from Bratislava, and made her into a maid and treated her shockingly. I don't know their name and I wouldn't give it if I knew. And eventually we found our way back to Bratislava, after it was liberated, of course.
Marta describes going to these various DP camps. And these DP camps were run by different non-governmental organizations like the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Association, the Red Cross, and also governments like USSR, like Marta had mentioned. And these were erected in various different locations, sometimes in what had been a concentration or a death camp, such as Bergen-Belsen was turned into a DP camp. But contrary to the concentration and death camps, the DP camps, or displaced peoples camps, were hope for new life. They allowed survivors to get necessary medical attention, such as in this photograph right here in the middle of your screen, which shows some women in the Bergen-Belsen DP camp receiving medical attention in a medical ward by the Red Cross. Oftentimes, young children were receiving the first formal education of their entire lives, such as in this bottom photograph right here. And, you know, sometimes even having religious celebrations, such as this children's Hanukkah party on the bottom right with items that have been donated by American families. For young adults, sometimes they're able to receive vocational training that they could take and actually build a career for themselves. So this is a group of young adult survivors who were learning how to sew with machines donated by the American Joint Distribution Committee. But life in DP camps also came with its challenges. You know, even though people were meeting and marrying and actually building lives, such as this photograph right here of a wedding in a DP camp, other people learned in the DP camps that their entire families had been murdered in the Holocaust. And I'd like to also point out that it wasn't just Holocaust survivors who were in these displaced people's camps, it was any refugee. So this included people who had been prisoners of war or slave laborers as well. But there was a unique challenge for children in DP camps, especially children who had lost their family. A May 1946 report by the UN estimates that there were around 9,000 children survivors after the Holocaust who had no remaining relatives. They had all been murdered in one way or another, or could not be found. And so the challenge was what to do with these 9,000 children. That's a lot of children. And of course, almost all of them were away from where they had been born. So oftentimes they were sent to orphanages or to immigrate to different countries or with foster families. And we'll speak about some of this a little later. But these children also had very little legal protection. And, you know, even if they did have surviving family members, oftentimes refugees didn't have physical documents proving their identity. And so reuniting children with their families, even if they had survived, was very, very challenging. And so in the meantime, a lot were sent to orphanages and foster families. But in one such case, a young girl named Josephine had been sent to go live with a foster family. And her not knowing that her biological mother, who she did not remember, was alive and looking for her. and her biological mother finally located her with help from the Red Cross in 1950, so 5 years after the war's end. And when she finally was able to go see Josephine, Josephine did not remember her and had become so attached to her foster family that she refused to go back with her biological mother to Yugoslavia. And she remained with her foster family for the rest of her life, which, you can imagine the heartbreaking reality of, being a parent in this scenario, and also just, the difficult emotions of also being a child at this time, and, honestly being very helpless, and at the whim of whatever adults, were taking on responsibility for you, but also having no real responsible adult, being your caregiver. And so, while these were some of the many challenges, of life in DP camps, there were many, many more as well. But, those were some of the specific ones for children. Tova Friedman, however, the author of The Daughter of Auschwitz, which is her memoir, was able to survive in Auschwitz with her mother. So her and her mother were liberated together, and Tova was only 5 years old. She was one of the youngest Auschwitz survivors. And she talks about her story of survival and surviving with her mother, as well as their liberation, in her memoir, which is available in the San Antonio Public Library system in audiobook, ebook, and physical form if you're interested in checking it out. So Sevek, or Sidney Finkel, did not spend time in a DP camp. Instead, he was sent to an orphanage. His home was bombed. He was born in Poland, and his entire family was sent to a ghetto. And from this ghetto, he was deported to various concentration camps, until finally ending up in Buchenwald. Sevek remained in Buchenwald for a few years before being forced on a death march. He arrived in Theresienstadt, and it was liberated one day later. He was only 12 years old when he was liberated from the Holocaust. I'd like you to pay particular attention to how he describes his experience in the orphanage after being liberated, and what that was like for him.
I got typhus. I was very sick. I thought I was going to die, but I had the image of my father and mother coming to me and saying I must survive. And I opened my eyes, and there was some wonderful young people from England that came as volunteers, and they took me to a home, and they fed me slowly. That was important, because people gorged themselves and the stomach couldn't handle it, and and they died of the headaches. And one day while I'm in that house, I hear my name Sevek being called from the street. So I run to the window, and lo and behold, there's my brother walking the street shouting my name, because he had heard that there was a kid from Buchenwald that had come. So once I met my brother, I was delighted. I was so happy. And I didn't have to make any more decisions on my own. My brother would take care of me. We desperately try. It's hard to find, and we couldn't find anybody. We found a cousin, two cousins. Don't forget, we had a huge family, 6 sisters. They all had large families. And we couldn't find anybody else. The British government allowed 1,000 young people to come to England once they were under the age of 16, or 13, something like that. And most of the kids were adults, like young adults. So they changed our certificate. We didn't have a certificate. We didn't have a birth certificate. So everybody became younger. And the British government sent Lancaster planes to Prague. And we were on top. That's the picture of my book. It was very difficult. It's very difficult because I didn't know the language. But I picked it up quickly, so it was terrible in the sense that, in the boarding school came the Parents' Day. All the parents would come in and so on. You wouldn't have anyone. Come the holidays, they don't know what to do with you. So they look for some family that will take you to.
So while Sevek had a very negative experience while in these orphanages, other people felt like orphanages gave them a second chance at having a childhood, which had been taken away from them because of their imprisonment in these concentration and death camps. One such young child survivor was Renee Kochman, who writes, "I emerged from the death camps after enduring the most terrible experience ever recorded in history, damaged in body and spirit. After indescribable losses, my family, my childhood, and my friends, I was overwhelmed with the emotional and physical pain. The Kinderheim in Blankenese restored part of my lost childhood to me. It became my home. My children and my teachers and the other girls I met became my friends and my family." A lot of these orphanages were run by organizations such as the French OSE, or Oeuvre de Secours aux Enfants, or different Holocaust survivors. There were a lot of Holocaust survivors after liberation, older Holocaust survivors, who kind of took it on as their mission to help these children who had lost their families. And so some of these photographs on the right-hand side are of these kind of chosen families that these Holocaust survivors had made with one another after their liberation, because even if they had no experience raising children or operating an orphanage in any sense, what they lacked in experience, they made up in emotional empathy with one another because they had experienced the same things. One woman who ran an OSE home in France named Judith Hemmingdinger described there were a group of boys that came in, and they were some of the Buchenwald boys, which, a little side note, in the Buchenwald concentration camp, 900 Jewish youth were liberated. And so the males of this group were known as the Buchenwald boys. And Judith Hemmingdinger's orphanage took in some of these boys. And she described that when they came, they had a general system at meal times where the staff would distribute bread. And the boys found it very distressing because it reminded them of being in the concentration and death camps and, the severe food rationing that happened there. And so they found that event very distressing, and oftentimes they would hide food under their beds and in their pillows because they were so worried that they were going to have a lack of food like they had for most of their lives at this point. And so in order to kind of help these boys transition from being in this survival state to actually becoming children, and, living with that emotional, I don't know what the word is, but not having the same fear that they had, been on guard with for so many years, they would put the bread on the table instead so the boys could take it whenever they wanted. And they started keeping the kitchens open 24/7 so that the boys could just go down there and get food rather than being worried that they were not going to have any. And these very small actions really made a huge difference. There was also, for some children, an aspect of wanting to keep kosher after they'd been liberated. While there were some children after the Holocaust who had associated their Judaism with such fear and violence for so long that they wanted to completely remove themselves from their Jewish identity, There were others who found a lot of comfort in being able to practice their Jewish identity openly and freely. And so the fact that they couldn't keep kosher in some of these orphanages was really distressing for them. And oftentimes, these more observant Jewish youth were sent to go with families or orphanages that could accommodate their dietary observances. While some children were young enough to go into these orphanages or to live with foster families, oftentimes if they were over the age of 16, they weren't able to do this, and they had to figure out what to do. Dr. Edith Eva Eger went into Auschwitz at the age of 16, and she actually, upon liberation, was amongst a pile of dead bodies and used all of her strength to signal to an American soldier that she was still alive. And she was liberated with her sister, and she was too old to go into one of these orphanages, so she ended up eventually immigrating to the United States. And Dr. Eger became a practicing psychologist. And so in her memoir, The Choice, she not only talks about her journey of survival, but also how she suffered with survivor's guilt, suicidal depression, and PTSD, and began telling her experiences, not only to heal within herself, but to help her patients who were, trying to heal from their own traumas. If you've ever read Dr. Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, Dr. Eger and him were actually friends, and both psychologists, and so she talks about him in her book, and a lot of them, they have very similar themes to one another. So if you're interested in checking it out, it's available in ebook and physical form. So I mentioned that Dr. Eger eventually immigrated, and a lot of survivors who were older, even if they were in their older teens, eventually did immigrate. A lot of Jews felt like there was no hope for them left in Europe, because even though, the Holocaust had ended and World War II had ended, anti-Semitism didn't just go away. And seeing the anti-Semitism that had existed and just everyday people were so okay with, or even, the anti-Semitic ideas that they had expressed themselves, didn't make Jews feel very safe in Europe anymore. And so many of them immigrated to the United States or the United Kingdom. Many immigrated to British Mandate Palestine. And this is what I'd like to focus on here. This is another history that I could spend days and days and days telling you. So I'll just try and hit the highlight points. I keep referring to it as British Mandate Palestine. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what this means. So at the time, in the early 1920s or so, different European countries kind of went into the Middle East and started colonizing the territory. And the League of Nations in 1922 recognized this colonization as a mandate. And so Great Britain had mandate over the territory of Palestine, while France had mandate over the territory of Lebanon and Syria. So this is what British mandate means. And during the Holocaust, the British actively fought against Jewish immigration to the land. There were some Jewish organizations that were pushing for it, but the British deemed it, quote unquote, a threat to the stability of a region essential to the war effort. And they actually made it illegal for Jews to immigrate to the land at this time. However, after the Holocaust ended, a lot of countries and international organizations really pushed the British to allow Jews to immigrate. And the British let up a little bit. However, they implemented a 75,000 person migration quota. But this is a very small quota, especially considering how many Jews had survived and were living in Europe at the time and wanted to leave. So some people were so desperate that they illegally immigrated by either stowing away on different legal migration ships, or even by chartering small boats that would take them, often in the middle of the night. But on May 14th, 1948, the state of Israel was officially established. And there was a large influx of migration. The British had pulled out and there was a 1-year civil war and the state was finally established. And in the first 3 years after the establishment of the state of Israel, over 600,000 Jews immigrated from Europe to what became Israel. But I'd really like to focus on this bottom photograph right here, which is of a political demonstration. This is a protest against the forced return of the Exodus refugee ship. The Exodus was an illegal immigrant ship carrying 4,500 Jewish DPs or refugees. The British, however, had intercepted the ship off of the coast, and they forced everybody aboard to board 3 different smaller ships, and they sent these ships back to France. And when these ships got to France, the people aboard refused to get off, and so the British had to forcibly remove them. And many of these people remained in DP camps in France and throughout Europe until the state of Israel was established. And from there, once the state of Israel was established, they eventually migrated. But it has become known as kind of a symbol for the desperate attempt for so many Jews after the Holocaust to immigrate to Israel. So this very last oral history that I'm going to share with you is from a man named Wolfgang Hellpap, who immigrated in the first wave of children to Palestine. He was actually not a survivor of the concentration camps, but survived in hiding with his family in Berlin. He was around 15 when the war ended. And while he had survived alongside some of his family members, he had to immigrate on his own. And his story parallels a lot of child survivors as well, which is why I chose him.
A little bit from that, yeah. So we got all into buses, 2 buses. And the mother said, my mother said, they told her that she can come later, but right now be just taking us to Palestine. And so we went into trucks and stuff, and start going. But then they divided Germany into zones. There was the Russian zone, and they were in Berlin, and you had to leave the Russian zone to get into the American zone, And then in the Russians, when we left some of the buses, they said, "Oh, go to Moscow, to Moscow." Well, we didn't. We kept on going into the American zone finally. But in the meantime, also my mother, before that, before I even got into those buses, before that, my mother decided to stay in the Russian zone in Berlin is not good, so let's try to at least get into the American zone of Berlin, There was no wall yet, but you had to go into the train to get into the Russian zone, and you couldn't get any package or any luggage because the Russians were patrolling the trains, So actually, we got into the American zone. That's when my highest really picked me up because we went into a settlement there in Stuttgart, Germany. And so that's where they picked me up, and we got into the trains and we go to France first. So we got to Paris, and from Paris we traveled all the way down to Marseille. In the meantime, I learned to speak French pretty good. I was talking perfectly French. And because a long time went by, about 5, 6 months before they said a ship, they're going to take us to Palestine. And finally the ship came along in Marseille, and we boarded the ship. And they told us too, that we're going to hide some young people, young men. You're going to hide them because in Palestine, we're going to need those young people. We got conflicts and problems over there too. So I said, okay. We got in there, and I had one young man that was hiding with me, in the ship. And so we traveled, came to Haifa, Palestine. And the English came aboard, the English. The second Nazis, all of a sudden they they came with weapons and everything looking for illegals, you know. And they find that young man, they found some of these young men, they took them away, you know. And here we are. They took him to Cyprus or something where they established some camps for illegals that trying to sneak into Israel or to Palestine. But we were the first Jewish children transport from Europe to Palestine, so they had a big welcome for us, you know. We came from the war zone.
So what I've played for you today is 4 stories out of hundreds of thousands. And I always like to end my presentations with a quote. So I'll read this one now. Through the art of storytelling, we can preserve our heritage, educate future generations, and inspire change. Even the youngest Holocaust survivors today are in their late 80s and early 90s. So if you ever have a chance to hear somebody speak in person or even, hear the oral history online, I highly recommend you take it. We are now the stewards of these stories, and it's our duty to make sure that they keep being passed down from generation to generation so that the memory and stories of the Holocaust are preserved and not lost. So again, I'd like to thank you for being here today. If you're interested in maybe hearing Rose's oral history or any others, I would highly encourage you to check out the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio at hmmsa.org. And now that you know, what will you do? So we'll open questions right now. I'll leave this screen up for a little bit, which has the books that I recommended during the presentation. If you want to take a picture or a screenshot, so you have that for your reference.
Hi, Raina. This is Madi. I'm going to go ahead and go through our questions in the chat. We have one question about a point that you mentioned earlier. Charles asks, it was mentioned that there were 9,000 kids whose families were gone. Did the British or USA governments work to get the families' inheritance or properties back to those children?
Oftentimes, no. Oftentimes, the homes of these people had been taken over by, either Nazis or Germans or, whoever else. And so there was no getting the homes back. Sometimes these people were kind enough to let the families go back, but more often than not, they were not allowed to go back. And there was no assistance from the government. I mean, most governments were kind of in shambles themselves, because they had been, non-existent for years because they'd been taken over by the Nazis. So, there was a lot of things going on at the same time. And so that just wasn't a priority, I fear.
Okay, thank you. And we had one question earlier. We just want to confirm, what was the name of the first person who was speaking in the YouTube video? Can you confirm if that was Sarah Kleinplatz?
Yeah, it was Sarah Kleinplatz. Sarah Kleinplatz, and then Marta Weiss, and then Sevek, who was also known as Sidney Finkel, and then Wolfgang Hellpap. Yeah, so Wolfgang Hellpap, last one.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing any other questions at this time. Do we want to give it a couple of minutes?
I do think my room reservation is actually ending, so I'm not sure I can stay on for much longer, because I do see somebody out in the hallway. So I apologize about that.
Not a problem. If we do get any more questions in the chat, we can always email them to you.
Okay, yeah, I'll put my email in the chat. So, if somebody wants to, they're more than welcome to send questions later. I know sometimes questions arise, a bit after you've heard the information. So.
Okay, then if we're ready to wrap up, I'll go ahead and make our closing statement. We just want to thank you, everyone, for attending our program this morning. A recording of this program is going to be posted to the library's YouTube channel and to our Holocaust Learn and Remember LibGuide. We also have 3 more events in this series in person, and you can check our online calendar to see those location, dates, and times. And thank you, Raina, for coming to do this absolutely wonderful presentation. I think we all learned so much.
Thank you. Thank you for all your help. Right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.